series of ASMR leftist readings. Well, congratulations if you made it to the last chapter of Capitalist Realism. And today we will be reading chapter 9, which is the last chapter of the book. It's titled Marxist Supernanny. That's a show I would want to watch. And thank you for all the support once again. If you have been following this journey, or if you're interested in hearing out about the next readings, please like, share and subscribe. That helps the channel grows and just go in the right direction if you people engage with it and with the content you want to hear. So, chapter 9. Without any further ado, that's always my sentence. Chapter 9, Marxist Supernanny. Nothing could be a clearer illustration of what Zizek has identified as the failure of the father function, the crisis of the paternal superego in late capitalism, than a typical edition of Supernanny. The program offers what amounts to a relentless, although of course implicit, attack on postmodernity's permissive hedonism. Supernanny is a Spinozist insofar as, like Spinoza, she takes it for granted that children are in a state of abjection. They are unable to recognize their own interests, unable to apprehend either the causes of their actions or their usually deleterious effects. But the problems that Supernanny confronts do not arise from the action or character of the children, who can only be expected to be idiotic hedonists, but with the parents. It is the parents' following of the trajectory of the pleasure principle, the path of least resistance, that causes most of the misery in the families, in a pattern that quickly becomes familiar. The parents' pursuit of the easy life leads them to accede to their children every demand, which becomes increasingly tyrannical. Rather like many teachers or other workers in what used to be called public service, Supernanny has to sort out problems of socialization that the family can no longer resolve. A Marxist Supernanny would of course turn away from the troubleshooting of individual families to look at the structural causes which produce the same repeated effect. The problem is that late capitalism insists and relies upon the very equation of desire with interests that parenting used to be based on rejecting. In a culture in which the paternal concept of duty has been subsumed into the maternal imperative to enjoy, it can seem that the parent is failing in their duty if they in any way impede their children's absolute right to enjoyment. Partly, this is an effect of the increasing requirement that both parents work. In these conditions, when the parent sees the child very little, the tendency will often be to refuse to occupy the oppressive function of telling the child what to do. The parental disavowal of this role is doubled at the level of cultural production by the refusal of gatekeepers to do anything but give audiences what they already appear to want. The concrete question is, if a return to the paternal superego, the stern father in the home, Radian superciliousness in broadcasting is neither possible nor desirable, then how are we to move beyond the culture of monotonous moribund conformity that results from a refusal to challenge or educate? A question as massive as this cannot, of course, be finally answered in a short book such as this, and what follows here will amount to a few starting points and suggestions. In brief, though, I believe that it is Spinoza who offers the best resources for thinking through what a paternalism without the father might look like. In Tarring with the Negative, Zizek famously argues that a certain Spinozism is the ideology of late capitalism. Zizek believes that Spinoza's rejection of the ontology for an ethics based around the concepts of health is allegedly flat with capitalism's amoral, affective engineering. The famous example here is Spinoza's reading of the myth of the fall and the foundation of law. On Spinoza's account, God does not condemn Adam for eating the apple because the action is wrong. He tells him that he should not consume the apple because it will poison him. For Zizek, this dramatizes the termination of the father function. An act is wrong not because Daddy says so. Daddy only says it is wrong because performing the act will be harmful to us. In Zizek's view, Spinoza's move both deprives the grounding of law in a statistic act of scission, the cruel cut of castration, at the same time as it denies the ungrounded positioning of agency in an act of pure volition, in which the subject assumes responsibility for everything. In fact, Spinoza has immense resources for analyzing the effective regime of late capitalism, the Videodrome control apparatus described by Burroughs, Philip K. Dick, and David Cronenberg, in which agency is dissolved in a phantasmagoric haze of psychic and physical intoxicants. Like Burroughs, Spinoza shows that, from being an aberrant condition, addiction is the standard state for human beings, who are habitually enslaved into reactive and repetitive behaviors by frozen images of themselves and the world. Freedom, Spinoza shows, is something that can be achieved only when we can apprehend the real causes of our action, when we can set aside the sad passions that intoxicate and entrance us. There is no doubt that late capitalism certainly articulates many of its injunctions via an appeal to a certain vision of health. The banning of smoking in public places, the relentless monstering of working class diet or programs like "you are what you eat" do appear to indicate that we are already in the presence of a paternalism without the father. It is not that smoking is wrong, it is that it will lead to our failing to lead long and enjoyable lives. But there are limits to this emphasis on good health. Mental health and intellectual development barely feature at all, for instance. What we see instead is a reductive hedonic model of health, which is all about feeling and looking good. To tell people how to lose weight or how to decorate their house is acceptable, but to call for any kind of cultural improvement is to be oppressive and elitist. The alleged elitism and oppression cannot consist in the notion that a third party might know someone's interest better than they know it themselves, since, presumably, smokers are deemed either to be unaware of their interest or incapable of acting in accordance with them. No, the problem is that only certain types of interest are deemed relevant, since they reflect values that are held to be consensual. Losing weight, decorating your house, and improving your appearance belong to the consentimental regime. In an excellent interview at theregister.com, the documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis identifies the contours of this regime of affective management. TV now tells you what to feel. It does not tell you what to think anymore. From EastEnders to reality format show, you're on the emotional journey of people, and through the editing, it gently suggests to you what is the agreed form of feeling. Hugs and kisses, I call it. I nicked that off Mark Ravenhill, who wrote a very good piece which said that if you analyze television now, it's a system of guidance. It tells you who is having the bad feelings and who is having the good feelings, and the person who is having the bad feelings is redeemed through a hugs and kisses moment at the end. It really is a system not of moral guidance, but of emotional guidance. Morality has been replaced by feeling. In the empire of the self, everyone feels the same, without ever escaping a condition of solipsism. What people suffer from, Curtis claims, is being trapped within themselves in a world of individualism. Everyone is trapped within their own feelings, trapped within their own imagination. Our job as a public service broadcaster is to take people beyond the limits of their self, and until we do that, we will carry on declining. The BBC should realize that. I have an idealistic view, but if the BBC could do that, taking people beyond their own selves, it will renew itself in a way that jumps over the competition. The competition is obsessed by serving people in their little selves, and in a way, actually, Murdoch, for all this power, is trapped by the self. That's his job, to feed the self. In the BBC, it's the next step forward. It doesn't mean we go back to the 1950s and tell people how to dress. What we do is say, we can free you from yourself, and people would love it. Curtis attacks the internet because, in his views, it facilitates communities of solipsists into passive networks of like-minded who confirm, rather than challenge, each other's assumptions and prejudices. Instead of having to confront other point of view in a contested public space, these communities retreat into closed circuits. But, Curtis claims, the impact of internet lobbies on old media is disastrous, since not only does its reactive proactivity allow the media class to further abdicate its function to educate and lead, it also allows populist currents on both the left and the right to bully media producers into turning out programming that is anodyne and mediocre. Curtis' critique has a point, but it misses important dimensions of what is happening on the net. Contrary to Curtis' account of blogging, blogs can generate new discourse networks that have no correlate in the social field outside cyberspace. As old media increasingly becomes subsumed into PR and the consumer report replaces the critical essay, some zones of cyberspace offer resistance to a critical compression that is elsewhere depressingly pervasive. Nevertheless, the interpassive simulation of participation in postmodern media, the network narcissism of MySpace and Facebook has, in the main, generated content that is repetitive, parasitic, and conformist. In a seeming irony, the media's class refusal to be paternalistic has not produced a bottom-up culture of breathtaking diversity, but one that is increasingly infantilized. By contrast, it is paternalistic culture that treats audiences as adult, assuming that they can cope with cultural products that are complex and intellectual demanding. The reason that focus groups and capitalists' feedback system fail, even when they generate commodities that are immensely popular, is that the people do not know what they want. This is not only because people's desire is already present but concealed from them, although this is often the case. Rather, the most powerful forms of desires are precisely cravings for the strange, the unexpected, the weird. This can only be supplied by artists and media professionals who are prepared to give people something different from that which already satisfies them. By those, that is to say, prepared to take a certain kind of risk. The Marxist Supernanny would not only be the one who laid down limitation, who acted in our own interest when we are incapable of recognizing them ourselves, but also the one prepared to take this kind of risk, to wager on the strange and our appetite for it. It is another irony that capitalism's society of risk is much less likely to take this kind of risk than was the supposedly stodgy, centralized culture of the post-war social consensus. It was the public service-oriented BBC and Channel 4 that perplexed and delighted me with the likes of Tinker, Taylor, Soldiers By, Pinter Place and Tarkovsky Grid Seasons. It was this BBC that also funded the popular avant-gardism of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which embedded sonic experimentalism into everyday life. Such innovations are unthinkable now that the public has been displaced by the consumer. The effect of permanent structural instability, the cancellation of the long term, is invariably stagnation and conservatism, not innovation. This is not a paradox. As Adam Curtis' remake above make clear, the effects that predominate in late capitalism are fear and cynicism. These emotions do not inspire bold thinking or entrepreneurial since as far back as Alien and Blade Runner, were produced in the ostensibly horrible condition of the pre-Soviet Soviet state, meaning that the USSR acted as a cultural entrepreneur for Hollywood. Since it is now clear that a certain amount of stability is necessary for cultural vibrancy, the question to be asked is, how can this stability be provided, and by what agencies? It is well past time for the left to cease limiting its ambition to the establishing of a big state. But being at a distance from the state does not mean either abandoning the state or retreating into the private space of affects and diversity, which Zizek rightly argues is the perfect complement to neoliberalism domination of the state. It means recognizing that the goal of a genuinely new left should be not to take over. I think that's a typo, but that's just me. It means recognizing that the goal of a genuinely new left should be not be to take over the state, but to subordinate the state to the general will. This involves naturally resuscitating the very concept of a general will, reviving and modernizing the idea of a public space that is not reducible to an aggregation of individuals and their interests. The methodological individualism of the capitalist realist worldview presupposes that philosophy of Max Stirner as much as that of Adam Smith or Hayek, in that it regards notions such as the publics as spooks, phantom abstraction devoid of content. All that is real is the individual and their families. The symptoms of the failure of this worldview are everywhere. In a disintegrated social sphere in which teenagers shooting each other has become commonplace, in which hospitals incubate aggressive superbugs, what is required is that effect be connected to structural cause. Against the postmodernist suspicion of grand narratives, we need to reassert that, far from being isolated, contingent problems, these are all the effects of a single systematic cause, capital. We need to begin, as if for the first time, to develop strategies against the capital which presents itself as ontologically as well as geographically ubiquitous. Despite initial appearance and hopes, capitalist realism was not undermined by the credit crisis of 2008. The speculation that capitalism might be on the verge of collapsing soon proved to be unfounded. It quickly became clear that, far from constituting the end of capitalism, the bank bailouts were a massive reassertion of the capitalist realist insistence that there is no alternative. Allowing the banking system to disintegrate was held to be unthinkable, and what ensued was a vast hemorrhaging of public money into private hands. Nevertheless, what did happen in 2008 was the collapse of the framework which has provided ideological cover for capitalist accumulation since the 1970s. After the bank bailouts, neoliberalism has, in every sense, been discredited. That is not to say that neoliberalism has disappeared overnight. On the contrary, its assumptions continue to dominate political economy, but they do so now no longer as part of an ideological project that has a confident forward momentum, but as inertial and defaults. We can now see that while neoliberalism was necessarily capitalist realism need not to be neoliberal. In order to save itself, capitalism could revert to a model of social democracy or to a children of men like authoritarianism. Without a credible and coherent alternative to capitalism, capitalist realism will continue to rule the political, economic unconscious. But even if it is now evident that the credit crisis will not lead to the end of capitalism all by itself, the crisis has led to the relaxing of a certain kind of mental paralysis. We are now in a political landscape littered with what Alex Williams called ideological rubble. It is year zero again, and a space has been cleared for a new anti-capitalism to emerge which is not necessarily tied to the old languages or traditions. One of the left vices is its endlessly rehearsal of historical debate, its tendency to keep going over Kronstadt or the new economic policy, rather than planning and organizing for a future that it really believes in. The failure of previous form of anti-capitalist politic organization should not be a cause for despair, but what needs to be left behind is a certain romantic attachment to the politics of failure, to the comfortable position of a defeated marginality. The credit crisis is an opportunity, but it needs to be treated as a tremendous speculative challenge, a spur for a renewal that is not a return. As Badiou has forcefully insisted, an effective anti-capitalism must be a rival to capital, not a reaction to it. There can be no return to pre-capitalist territorialities. Anti-capitalism must oppose capital's globalism with its own authentic universality. It is crucial that a genuinely revitalized left confidently occupy the new political terrain I have very provisionally sketched here. Nothing is inherently political. Politicization requires a political agent which can transform the taken for granted into the up for grabs. If neoliberalism triumphed by incorporating the desire of the post-68 working class, a new left could begin by building on the desire which neoliberalism has generated, but which it has been unable to satisfy. For example, the left should argue that it can deliver what neoliberalism signally failed to do, a massive reduction of bureaucracy. What is needed is a new struggle over work and who controls it, an assertion of worker autonomy as opposed to control by management, together with a rejection of certain kinds of labor, such as the excessive auditing which has become so central feature of work in post-Fordism. This is a struggle that can be won, but only if a new political subject coalesces. It is an open question as to whether the old structure, such as the trade unions, will be capable of nurturing the subjectivity, or whether it will entail the formation of wholly new political organizations. New forms of industrial action need to be instituted against managerialism. For instance, in the case of teachers and lecturers, the tactics of strikers or even of marking bans should be abandoned because they only hurt students and members. At the college where I used to work, one-day strikes were pretty much welcomed by management because they saved on the wage bill whilst causing negligible disruption to the college. What is needed is the strategic withdrawal of forms of labor which will only be noticed by management. All of the machineries of self-surveillance that have no effect whatsoever on the delivery of education, but which managerialism could not exist without. Instead of the gestural spectacular politics around noble causes like Palestine, it's time that teaching unions got far more imminent and take the opportunity opened up by the crisis to begin to write public services of business ontology. When even businesses can't be run as businesses, why should public services? We must convert widespread mental health problems from medicalized condition into effective antagonisms. Affective disorders are forms of captured discontent. This disaffection can and must be channeled outwards, directed toward its real cause, capital. Furthermore, the proliferation of certain kinds of mental illnesses in late capitalism makes the case for a new austerity, a case that is also made by the increasing urgency of dealing with environmental disaster. Nothing contradicts capitalism's constitutive imperative towards growth more than the concept of rationing goods and resources. Yet, it is becoming uncomfortably clear that consumer self-regulation and the market will not by themselves avert environment catastrophe. There is a libidinal as well as practical case to be made for these new assesses. If, as Oliver James, Zizek and Supernanny have shown, unlimited license leads to a misery and disaffection, then limitations placed on desire are likely to quicken rather than deaden it. In any case, rationing of some sort is inevitable. The issue is whether it will be collectively managed or whether it will be imposed by authoritarian means when it is already too late. Quite what forms this collective management should take is, again, an open question, one that can only be resolved practically and experimentally. The long dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The possibility under capitalist realism, from a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. So, this was chapter 9 of Capitalist Realism, the last chapter, and quite interesting, a bit of a hopeful ending. But I mean, I believe there are pros and cons about this book, good things and a bit less good things about it. It would be interesting for me to hear if you've read the book or if you've listened to the entire ASMR series. It would be interesting for me to know what you've thought about the book, and it might even be possible that I put together a video to discuss all the different critiques to the book from the left, because the left does that very well, criticizing other people's work. The light at the back has gone off halfway through. I realized it halfway through the video, and I had a bit of like a 2-second bug in my brain. I don't know if that's how you say it in English, but thank you very much again for listening to Capitalist Realism ASMR with me, and I hope to see you again soon. We will be reading shorter formats for a while now, so I